The frost had crept beneath my bedroom door again. I remember thinking that as I lay shivering in my thin nightgown, my arms wrapped around my knees, my teeth chattering so loudly I was certain my sister Eleanor could hear them from her room down the hall. But, of course, Eleanor wasn't cold. Eleanor had my blanket, the thick woolen one Grandmother had knitted for me before she died, the one with the intricate blue patterns that reminded me of winter storms over frozen lakes. Eleanor always had my blanket, and somehow I always let her take it. That was the night I died. Not dramatically, not with fire or violence or any of the spectacular endings one reads about in novels. I simply grew too cold. My body, weakened by months of inadequate food and rest, surrendered to the bitter January temperatures that seeped through the cracks in my walls that Father had promised to repair, but never did, because Eleanor's room needed new curtains first, and Eleanor's piano needed tuning, and Eleanor required a new winter coat for the Hartwell's annual ball. I died curled up like a question mark on my narrow bed, and my last coherent thought was of my sister, warm and content under my grandmother's blanket, dreaming of the dancing she would do at tomorrow's party. When I opened my eyes again, I was standing in a garden. Not just any garden. The garden at Thornwood Manor, where I had spent my childhood summers before Mother passed. The roses were in full bloom, impossibly red against the green, and the air smelled of honeysuckle and distant rain. I recognised every stone in the winding path, every twist of the ancient wisteria that climbed the garden wall, and I recognised the woman standing before me. "Grandmother," I whispered. She looked exactly as I remembered her. Silver hair pinned beneath a simple cap, eyes the colour of storm clouds, hands rough from decades of needlework and gardening. She wore the same blue dress she had been buried in, but it no longer seemed like death's clothing. It seemed simply like her. "Olivia," she said, and her voice was exactly as I remembered it too, warm as fresh bread, steady as the earth. "My dear girl, you've come too soon." "I'm dead," I said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Grandmother reached out and touched my cheek, and I felt tears I hadn't known I was crying. "But that doesn't mean your story is finished." She led me to a stone bench beneath an arbour of climbing roses, and we sat together as she explained. "Time worked differently here," she said. "We had hours to talk, though only seconds would pass in the world I had left behind. And there were choices to be made. You can stay here," Grandmother said. "There is peace in this garden, and eventually you would move on to whatever comes next. But there is another path." She took my cold hands in her warm ones. "You can go back. Back. To that house, to my family. To the moment before everything went wrong, to the day your mother died." I stared at her. "That was 8 years ago. I was 12. "Yes. And in those 8 years, your sister and father consumed everything good in your life like locusts in a wheat field. They took your inheritance, your health, your warmth, your very will to survive." Grandmother's grip tightened on my fingers. "But it doesn't have to be that way. If you return to that moment with everything you know now, you can make different choices. You can protect yourself. You can live." "Why?" I asked. "Why would I be given such a chance?" Grandmother smiled, and for a moment I saw something vast and ancient behind her familiar features. "Because, my dear girl, you spent 20 years of your life giving everything to people who gave nothing back. Because you died with kindness still in your heart despite having every reason to let it wither. Because the universe occasionally recognizes a debt that needs to be paid." "And if I go back, what must I do?" "Simply live," Grandmother said. "Live for yourself this time. Keep your warmth for those who deserve it." She released my hands and stood. "But know this, Olivia. You will remember everything. Every cold night, every stolen blanket, every meal you went without so Eleanor could have a second helping. Every time your father looked through you as though you were made of glass, the pain will not disappear simply because you return to a younger body. You will carry it with you, and you must decide what to do with it. I thought of Eleanor, wrapped in my blanket. Her honey-coloured hair spread across the pillow that used to be mine. I thought of Father, signing documents that transferred my mother's jewellery to Eleanor's name because Eleanor was the one who would marry well. Eleanor was the one who mattered. I thought of the ice in my veins as I died. "I'll go back," I said. Grandmother kissed my forehead. "Then wake up, Olivia, and this time, keep yourself warm." The garden dissolved into white light, and I fell. I woke to the sound of weeping. For a disorienting moment, I thought I was still in my cold bedroom, that the tears were my own. But as my vision cleared, I realised I was lying in a much larger bed, surrounded by much finer sheets, and the weeping was coming from somewhere to my left. I turned my head and saw Eleanor. She was 12 years old, with baby fat still softening her cheeks and her hair in 2 untidy braids. She sat in a chair beside my bed, clutching a handkerchief that was already soaked through, and when she saw my eyes open, she let out a cry that brought servants running. "Olivia! Father! Father! She's awake!" I blinked slowly, trying to orient myself. The room was familiar. My childhood bedroom at our townhouse in the city, before Father moved us to the country estate after Mother's death. The wallpaper was the pale yellow I remembered, the curtains the same delicate lace. On the nightstand sat a small bottle of medicine and a well-worn copy of poetry that I had read to Mother during her final weeks. Mother. This was the day Mother died. Child? Father's voice, and then his face appeared in my field of vision. Younger, less lined, with less grey in his dark hair. He looked worried. I tried to remember the last time in my other life that he had looked at me with worry. I couldn't. "Olivia, can you hear me? The doctor said you had a fever, that you might not..." His voice cracked. Thank God, you're awake." "Where is Mother?" I asked. My voice came out thin and young, a child's voice, but the words were deliberate. Father's face changed. The worry shifted into something else. Grief, certainly, but also a hardness I recognised from the years to come. "Olivia, I need to tell you something. Your mother, she's dead," I said. Eleanor gasped. Father recoiled as though I had struck him. "How did you... The doctor only just..." "I knew when I woke up," I said. It was partly true. I had known the moment I opened my eyes to Eleanor's weeping because in my other life I had woken the same way, in the same bed, with the same grief pressing down on my chest like a stone. I felt her go. Father stared at me for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, seeming to accept this explanation, and sat down heavily in the chair Eleanor had vacated. "The fever took her in the night. The doctor says it was peaceful. She simply slipped away in her sleep." I nodded. I remembered this conversation from before, remembered how I had dissolved into tears and clung to Father's arm, begging him to tell me it wasn't true. I remembered how Eleanor had joined me, and we had cried together, and for a brief moment we had been sisters united in our grief. But I also remembered what came after, how Father's attention had slowly, inexorably shifted toward Eleanor. Beautiful Eleanor, charming Eleanor, Eleanor who looked so much like Mother that sometimes Father could hardly bear to look away. How my own resemblance to Father's side of the family made me a reminder of everything except the woman he had lost. How Eleanor had learned, with a child's instinctive cunning, that she could have anything she wanted if she only asked in the right way. I remembered the blanket. Grandmother's blanket, the one she had given me and me alone, pressing it into my hands 2 months before she died and saying, "This is for you, Olivia. Only for you." And I remembered Eleanor taking it, that first winter after Mother's death, claiming she was cold, claiming she couldn't sleep without it, claiming and claiming until claiming became taking and taking became simply the way things were. Not this time. "Father," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I would like to see Mother's solicitor." Father blinked. "What?" "Mother told me before she got sick that she had arranged certain things in her will, things meant specifically for me. I would like to make sure those arrangements are understood and honoured." The words felt strange coming from my 12-year-old mouth, but Father didn't seem to notice anything unusual about them. He was too caught up in his own grief, too surprised by my composure. "Olivia, this is hardly the time. It's exactly the time," I said. "Mother was very clear about her wishes. I don't want there to be any confusion." In my previous life, I had been too grief-stricken to think about practical matters. I had let Father handle everything, trusting him to be fair, not understanding that his fairness would be filtered through his growing preference for Eleanor. By the time I understood what had happened, that Mother's jewellery had been given to Eleanor for safekeeping, that the small inheritance meant for my dowry had been rolled into Eleanor's portion for efficiency, that even the books Mother had specifically bequeathed to me had ended up in Eleanor's room because Eleanor wanted them, it was too late to protest. Not this time. Father studied me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Very well," he said finally. "I'll send for Mr. Aldridge tomorrow. But for now, you need to rest. The fever nearly took you." I nodded and closed my eyes, letting him think I was simply tired. But behind my closed lids, I was making plans. The funeral was 3 days later. I stood beside the grave in my black dress, the one that actually fit me properly, since I had insisted on wearing my own clothes rather than accepting Eleanor's hand-me-down, and watched Mother's coffin lower into the ground. Eleanor wept beautifully, her golden head bowed, her small shoulders shaking with perfectly timed sobs. Father kept one arm around her, murmuring comfort. I stood apart. Not out of coldness, I grieved Mother as deeply as anyone. But I had already mourned her once, in another lifetime, and I understood now that public tears were currency in our household. Eleanor spent hers lavishly and was rewarded for it. I would save mine for moments when they mattered. After the funeral, Mr. Aldridge came to the house as Father had promised. He was a thin, bespectacled man with ink-stained fingers and an air of permanent anxiety. In my previous life, I had barely paid attention to his reading of the will, too lost in my grief to understand the implications. Now I listened to every word. "To my daughter, Eleanor," Mr. Aldridge read, his voice carrying in the silent parlour, "I leave my sapphire earrings and the gold bracelet that was my mother's, to be held in trust until her 18th birthday." Eleanor smiled tremulously, still playing the grieving daughter. "To my daughter Olivia, I leave the remainder of my personal jewellery, including the ruby pendant that was my grandmother's and the pearl set I wore on my wedding day. I also leave her the complete contents of my personal library, as well as the sum of £3,000, to be held in trust for her use until she reaches majority." I saw Father's eyebrows rise. He hadn't remembered, or perhaps hadn't noticed, that Mother's arrangements for me were more substantial than for Eleanor. In the previous life, he had consolidated my trust with Eleanor's for convenience, invested it poorly, and lost most of it in a failed business venture. The jewellery had been handed to Eleanor for safekeeping because, Father had reasoned, Eleanor was the older one and could be trusted with such things. But I was not going to let that happen again. "Mr. Aldridge," I said, my voice clear in the quiet room, "I would like my inheritance to remain exactly as my mother specified. My jewellery should be placed in a safety deposit box at the bank, under my name alone, accessible only to me when I come of age. My trust should be managed by your firm directly, with annual reports sent to me personally, and I would like a complete inventory of my mother's library, so that I may ensure every volume is accounted for." Miss Aldridge looked startled. He glanced at Father, who looked equally surprised. "Olivia," Father said slowly, surely there's no need for such formality. We're family. I can manage these things on your behalf. Mother specified her wishes clearly, I said. I intend to honour them, as I'm sure you do as well, Father. There was a moment of silence. Eleanor was staring at me with wide eyes, no longer weeping. Father's expression had shifted into something complicated. Surprise, certainly, but also something that might have been respect or perhaps wariness. Of course, Father said finally. Of course I intend to honour your mother's wishes. Mr. Aldridge, please make the arrangements as Olivia has requested. The solicitor nodded, still looking bemused, and made a note in his ledger. It was a small victory, but it was the first of many. The first winter after Mother's death was when Eleanor had taken my blanket, in my previous life. I remembered the moment clearly, Eleanor appearing in my doorway, tears in her eyes, claiming she couldn't sleep because she was so cold and so lonely, and she missed Mother so much. And couldn't she please borrow my blanket just for one night? One night had become a week had become a month. By spring, the blanket lived permanently in Eleanor's room, and everyone had forgotten it had ever been mine. But now, as the first chill crept into the house, and I saw Eleanor's calculating gaze drift toward my bedroom, I was ready. Grandmother had sent me the blanket a month before her death, just as I remembered. I had opened the package to find the thick wool, soft as clouds and warm as an embrace, folded around a note in a grandmother's spidery handwriting. For my Olivia. May this keep you warm through all the cold nights to come. I had cried when I read the note, not because I was sad, but because I remembered how casually Eleanor had taken this gift from me, how easily Father had dismissed my protests, how many winter nights I had spent shivering while my grandmother's love kept my sister warm instead. The evening it began, I was sitting in my room, reading by candlelight, with the blanket wrapped around my shoulders. There was a knock at my door. "Come in," I said, not looking up from my book. Eleanor entered. She was wearing a thin nightgown, and she had wrapped her arms around herself in a theatrical display of cold. I could see her breath misting slightly in the air. The house was genuinely chilly, I admitted. But Eleanor's room had a working fireplace. Mine did not. "Olivia," she said, her voice tremulous, "I'm so cold. I can't sleep. Could I possibly borrow your blanket? Just for tonight?" I looked up at her. In the candlelight, she looked younger than her 14 years, almost vulnerable. But I knew better now. I had seen what she would become if she continued down this path. Not a monster, exactly, but something almost worse. A woman who had never learned that other people's needs mattered, who took and took because taking was easier than giving, who would watch her sister freeze to death and feel only a vague discomfort at the inconvenience of funeral arrangements. "No," I said. Eleanor blinked. "What?" "No, you may not borrow my blanket. This was Grandmother's gift to me, specifically. If you're cold, ask Father to have the servants bring you extra bedding or move your bed closer to the fire." But Eleanor's lower lip trembled. In the past, this would have worked. I would have felt guilty, would have given in, would have told myself that one night didn't matter. "But Olivia, I'm your sister. Surely you can share—" "I can," I said. "I choose not to. This blanket is mine. If you would like a blanket of your own, I suggest you write to Grandmother and ask for one." It was a cruel thing to say. Grandmother was dead, after all, had died just weeks before Mother. But Eleanor had never written to Grandmother while she was alive, had never bothered to cultivate that relationship, while I had written letters every week and visited whenever Father permitted. The blanket was not just a warm piece of fabric, it was the physical manifestation of a love that Eleanor had never earned. Eleanor stared at me, her eyes widening. I saw the moment she realised that something had changed, that I was not the same sister she had always known. In my previous life, this realisation had never come. I had remained pliable and giving until the very end, convinced that if I just loved her enough, she would eventually love me back. "Fine," Eleanor said, her voice hardening. "Keep your silly blanket. I don't need it anyway." She turned and left, slamming the door behind her. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and went back to my book. The next morning, Eleanor complained to Father about my selfishness. I listened from the doorway as she spun her tale, how she had come to me desperate and cold, how I had cruelly rejected her, how she had spent the night shivering and miserable. "And after everything I've done for her," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "I shared my dolls with her when we were little. I let her borrow my ribbons. And now she won't even let me have one blanket for one night. Some... Olivia," Father said, turning to face me. His expression was stern. "Is this true?" I stepped fully into the room. "Father, did Eleanor mention that her room has a working fireplace, and mine does not? Did she mention that the blanket in question was a specific gift from grandmother to me alone, with a note explicitly stating it was for me? Did she mention that she has access to the entire household supply of bedding and could have asked the servants for additional blankets at any time?" Father's stern expression wavered. No, she didn't mention. I didn't refuse to help Eleanor stay warm," I continued. "I refused to give away a cherished inheritance from our recently deceased grandmother. If Eleanor is cold, the solution is not to take my things. The solution is to address the temperature of her room through the resources available to her." Eleanor was staring at me with barely concealed fury. This was not how things were supposed to go. In her world, she asked, she received, and no one questioned it. Father rubbed his temples. "Girls, please, we've only just lost your mother. Can we not have peace in this house?" "Of course, Mum, Father," I said smoothly. "I want nothing more than peace. But peace cannot mean that I give up everything that is mine whenever Eleanor asks for it. That isn't peace, that's surrender." There was a long silence. Then Father sighed. "Eleanor, if you need additional blankets, speak to the housekeeper. Olivia's blanket is her own." He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "And Olivia, try to be kinder to your sister. She's struggling too." "Yes, Father," I said, but I did not promise to give anything away. And that night, when I wrapped myself in grandmother's blanket and felt its warmth settle around me like an embrace, I slept better than I had in years. The months that followed were a careful dance of boundaries and battles. Eleanor tested me constantly. She wanted my books. I moved them to a locked cabinet and carried the key on a ribbon around my neck. She wanted my jewellery. I reminded her that it was held in trust at the bank and that she was welcome to visit her own jewellery there any time she liked. She wanted my attention, my time, my energy. I gave her what was appropriate and no more. It was exhausting, but it was also liberating. For the first time in either of my lives, I was not constantly running on empty. I ate full meals because I served myself before Eleanor could take the best portions. I slept warmly because my blanket stayed on my bed. I had energy because I was not spending every waking moment anticipating Eleanor's needs and sacrificing my own to meet them. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. Father noticed first. Without my constant capitulation making things easy for Eleanor, he was forced to actually parent her, to tell her no, to set limits, to help her understand that the world did not exist solely for her convenience. It was difficult for him. He had grown accustomed to my doing that work for him. But when I stopped, he had no choice but to step in. Eleanor noticed too. She fought it, of course. She was 14, she was grieving, she had spent her entire life being indulged. But she was not stupid, and she was not, at her core, evil. She was simply a child who had never been taught limits. The first time she genuinely apologized to Mimi was 6 months after Mother's death. I had been in the garden, reading when she came out and sat beside me on the bench. Her face was blotchy, as though she had been crying, and her hands were twisted together in her lap. "Olivia," she said, her voice small, "I'm sorry I tried to take your blanket." I looked at her over the top of my book. "Are you? Or are you sorry that I didn't let you have it?" She flinched. "Both, I suppose, but—" She took a shaky breath. "Father talked to me. He said that I've been taking advantage of you. He said that just because you're younger doesn't mean your things are less important than mine." She looked up at me, her eyes wet. "I didn't realize I was doing it. I asked for things, and you gave them to me, and I never thought about what that meant for you." I was silent for a moment, considering. In my previous life, Eleanor had never apologized. She had never been made to confront her own behavior, never been given the opportunity to grow. She had simply continued toying until there was nothing left, and then she had wondered, I suspect, why I had stopped fighting back. "Thank you," I said finally. "I appreciate the apology." "Does this mean—" Eleanor hesitated. "Does this mean we can be sisters again, properly?" "We never stopped being sisters," I said. "But being sisters doesn't mean I have to give you everything I have. It means we take care of each other equally. It means you don't take my blanket and I don't take your... whatever it is you have that's precious to you." "My music," Eleanor said quietly. "The piano, Mother's songs." I nodded. "Then I won't take those. And you won't take my books, or my blanket, or my inheritance, and we'll figure out the rest as we go." Eleanor sniffled, then nodded. "All right, that seems fair." It was a beginning, not a perfect one. There were still fights, still moments when Eleanor forgot herself and reverted to old habits. But each time I held my ground, and each time she was forced to reckon with the consequences of her actions. And slowly, the sister I had never known I could have began to emerge. The years passed differently this time. At 15, I was not the shadow I had been in my previous life. I had my mother's jewellery, properly stored and waiting for me. I had my trust, carefully managed and growing. I had my books, my blanket, my room that Father had finally repaired because I had insisted, calmly and repeatedly, until he could no longer pretend not to hear. And I had something else, something I had never had before. A sense of my own worth. It manifested in small ways at first. I spoke up in conversations instead of fading into the background. I wore colours that suited me rather than accepting Eleanor's cast-offs. I developed interests of my own: botany, astronomy, the study of ancient languages, and pursued them without apology. Father noticed. He looked at me differently now, with a respect that had been absent in my previous life. I was no longer the invisible daughter, the one who existed only to support Eleanor. I was Olivia, intelligent, determined, with a will of my own. At 16, I began to receive callers. This surprised me. In my previous life, I had been too thin, too tired, too worn down to attract attention. But now, with good food and adequate rest and the confidence that came from being treated as a person rather than a resource, I apparently possessed what the matchmaking mothers of our acquaintance called potential. I was not interested in marriage. Not yet. I had died at 20 without ever experiencing love, and while I was no longer on that path, I was in no hurry to bind myself to anyone. But I enjoyed the conversation, the attention, the sense that I was seen, and I was careful, so careful, because I remembered how easily in my previous life I had been overlooked in favour of Eleanor, and I knew that the same could happen again if I let my guard down. At 17, Eleanor became engaged. His name was Theodore Ashworth, the second son of a viscount, handsome and kind and genuinely besotted with Eleanor. I watched them together and felt something strange stir in my chest, something that might have been jealousy if I let it grow. But I didn't let it grow, because I understood now that Eleanor's happiness did not diminish my own. She had earned Theodore's love through her own efforts, had become a person worthy of such love through years of growth and struggle, and I was genuinely happy for her. The night before Eleanor's wedding, she came to my room. "I have something for you," she said, and pressed a small velvet box into my hands. I opened it to find a pair of sapphire earrings, the ones Mother had left to Eleanor, the ones she had worn to every ball and party since she turned 18. "Eleanor, I can't." "You can," she said firmly. "Mother left these to me, but she would have wanted you to have something too, something of hers that she wore and loved. And I have Theodore now. I have so much." She smiled a little shakily. "Let me give you this. Please." I looked at the earrings, gleaming in the candlelight. They were beautiful, more beautiful than anything I had received from Mother's estate, because Mother's taste had been exquisite, and these had been her favourites. "Thank you," I said. "I'll treasure them." Eleanor hugged me, and for the first time in either of my lives, it felt like a hug between equals. At 18, I came into my full inheritance. The ruby pendant, the pearl set, the £3,000 that had grown to nearly £4,000 through careful investment. The contents of Mother's library, still intact, filling the shelves of my sitting room. And the blanket, worn soft now with years of use, still wrapped around me every night as I slept. I was no longer the girl who had frozen to death alone in a cold room. I was a woman with resources, with options, with a future. At 19, I met Daniel. He was a scholar, a professor of classical languages at the university, with ink-stained fingers like Aldridge and a laugh that made my stomach flip. We met at a lecture on ancient Greek poetry, argued about the proper translation of a particular passage, and spent the next 3 hours in increasingly heated debate. By the end of the evening, I knew I wanted to see him again. By the end of the year, I knew I wanted to spend my life with him. Daniel was not wealthy, not titled, not any of the things Father had hoped for when he imagined my future husband. But he was kind and brilliant, and he looked at me as though I were the most interesting person in the world. He listened when I spoke. He valued my opinions. He never, not once, tried to take anything from me. "I love you," he said one evening, as we sat together in his cramped study, surrounded by towers of books. "I know I'm not what your father wanted for you. But I love you, Olivia. I have since the moment you told me my translation of Sappho was embarrassingly literal." I laughed, and then I cried, and then I kissed him. "I love you too," I said, "and I don't care what Father wanted. I want you." We married in the spring in a small ceremony with only family and close friends. Eleanor was my maid of honour, glowing with her own happiness. She was expecting her first child by then, a blessing that made her radiant. Father walked me down the aisle with tears in his eyes, and I understood finally that he did love me. He had always loved me. He had simply been too wrapped up in his own grief to show it properly, and Daniel waited for me at the altar, looking at me as though I were a miracle. Our life together was not luxurious, but it was warm. We had a modest house near the university filled with books and papers and the scent of the flowers I grew in our small garden. Daniel taught his classes and worked on his research, and I helped him with translations and pursued my own studies. We had long evenings of conversation and quiet mornings of reading, and a love that grew deeper with every passing year. The first winter of our marriage, Daniel bought me a new blanket, thick wool, beautifully made, in shades of blue that reminded me of grandmother's handiwork. I told him the story of my grandmother's blanket, the one I still kept folded at the foot of our bed, and he held me while I cried. "You'll never be cold again," he promised, "not as long as I'm here." And I believed him. When I was 20, the age I had been when I died, in that other life, I paused for a moment to consider. In my previous existence, I had been alone, frozen, forgotten. My sister had taken my blanket and my peace and my will to live. My father had looked through me as though I were made of glass. I had died with nothing, loved by no one, remembered by no one. But that Olivia was gone now. I had rewritten her story, word by word and choice by choice. I had kept my warmth for myself, and in doing so, I had found more warmth than I had ever imagined possible. That evening I sat in my garden, our garden, mine and Daniel's, and watched the sun set over the rooftops of the city. Daniel was inside, preparing dinner with the help of our one servant, and I could hear him humming a tune through the open window. In my lap was grandmother's blanket, worn soft with years of love. I thought about the cold, dark bedroom where I had died. I thought about Eleanor, who had changed so much, who was now a mother herself and who called me every week to share news and ask advice. I thought about Father, who had finally learned to see me, who sent letters full of pride about my scholarly accomplishments. I thought about the garden where grandmother had given me a choice, and the choice I had made. Keep your warmth for those who deserve it, she had said. I had done that. But somewhere along the way, I had learnt something else too, that when you keep your warmth for yourself, you don't diminish it. You don't become cold or selfish or small. Instead, you become a fire rather than a candle, bright enough to warm not just yourself, but everyone you love. The blanket was mine. It had always been mine. And now, for the first time, I understood why grandmother had given it to me. Not because she loved me more than Eleanor, not because I was special or chosen or destined for great things, but because she had seen, perhaps, that I was the kind of person who would give everything away until I had nothing left. And she had wanted me to have one thing, just one thing, that I would keep for myself. One thing to remind me that I deserved warmth too. The door opened behind me, and Daniel's footsteps approached across the garden path. He sat beside me on the bench, his shoulder warm against mine. "Dinner's almost ready," he said. "What are you thinking about?" I leaned my head against his shoulder. "About blankets," I said, "and cold winters, and the people who keep us warm." He kissed the top of my head. "That sounds like a story." "It is," I agreed. "A long one, but with a happy ending. Those are my favourite kind." We sat together in the fading light, wrapped in the blanket my grandmother had made, and I let the warmth of the present finally, completely heal the cold of a past that no longer existed, because I had made a different choice, because I had kept my warmth for myself, because in the end, that was what saved me, and that was enough. The years continued to unfold like pages in a book I was finally writing myself. Daniel and I had children, 2 daughters with their father's dark curls and my stubborn chin. I named the eldest Margaret after my grandmother and the second Eleanor after my sister, because by then we had become genuinely close in a way I had never imagined possible. When my niece was born, Eleanor wrote to me. "I understand now," she said. "I understand why you fought so hard to keep what was yours. Because now I would do anything to protect this child, to make sure she has everything she needs, to ensure no one ever takes from her the way I took from you." I wept when I read that letter, not from sadness, but from a relief so profound it felt like finally setting down a weight I had carried across 2 lifetimes. My Margaret was a serious child, bookish like her father, with a talent for languages that surpassed both of ours by the time she was 10. Little Eleanor was all fire and music, playing the piano with the same passion her aunt had shown, filling our house with melodies that made the neighbours stop on the street to listen. And through it all, grandmother's blanket remained. It was old now, worn thin in places. The blue patterns faded to a softer shade. But it still kept me warm on cold nights, and when my daughters were small, they would crawl into bed with me and Daniel, and I would wrap it around all of us, creating a cocoon of warmth that felt like safety. "Tell us the story of the blanket," Margaret would demand, and I would tell them. Not the full truth. They were too young for tales of death and rebirth, of cold rooms and colder hearts, but a version of the truth, about a grandmother who loved a little girl very much, who made her a blanket to keep her warm, who wanted her to remember that she deserved good things. "And you kept it," little Eleanor would say, her eyes wide. "Yes," I would agree, "I kept it, and I'll keep it forever." When Father died, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72, I held his hand at the end. He had changed so much in the years since Mother's death, or perhaps I had simply allowed myself to see him differently. He had been a flawed man, certainly, but he had loved us in his way, and in this life he had learned to love me properly. "I'm proud of you, Olivia," he said in one of our last conversations. You became exactly who you were meant to be." "I had help," I said. "From Daniel?" "From a lot of people." I squeezed his hand. "Including you, Father. Eventually." He smiled at that, a tired smile, but a genuine one. I didn't always see you clearly. I'm sorry for that." "I know," I said. "It's all right. You saw me eventually." And that was enough. It had to be enough. Because the alternative was carrying bitterness into whatever came next, and I had learned, in both my lives, that bitterness only consumed the one who held it. Eleanor wept at Father's funeral. So did I. We stood together by the grave, two sisters who had found their way to each other through years of struggle and growth, and we held hands while the minister spoke words of comfort. "I love you," Eleanor said as the coffin was lowered. "I never told you enough before. I love you, Olivia." "I love you too," I said, and meant it. At 50, I wrote a book. It was a translation of ancient Greek poetry with extensive commentary and analysis, the culmination of decades of study, a labour of love that Daniel helped me polish until every word shone. When it was published, scholars across the country wrote to praise it. Daniel was invited to lecture about our work, and he always insisted that I share the stage with him. "Your translation," he would say. "Your insights. I'm just the one with the university position." But we both knew it was more than that. We were partners in everything, equal in all things, two halves of a whole that had taken 2 lifetimes to find. At 60, Daniel died. It was sudden, a heart attack, the doctors said. One moment he was sitting in his study, working on a new translation, and the next, he was gone. I did not survive it easily. There were months when I could barely get out of bed, when the cold crept back into my bones despite all the blankets in the world. My daughters came to care for me, taking turns bringing their own children to fill the empty house with noise and life. And eventually, slowly, I began to warm again. Not because the grief faded, it never did, not entirely, but because I had learned in this life that warmth could survive even the deepest cold. That love did not disappear just because the one who gave it was gone. Daniel had kept me warm for 30 years. Now I kept myself warm with the memory of him. At 70, I gave Margaret the blanket. She was 42 by then, with children of her own, and she looked at me with tears in her eyes as I pressed the worn wool into her hands. "Mother, I can't." "You can," I said, "and you should." Grandmother made this blanket for me because she knew I needed to learn to keep my warmth for myself. But I've learned that lesson now. And it's time for the blanket to teach someone else. Margaret held it to her chest. "I'll treasure it." "I know you will. And someday you'll give it to your daughter or your granddaughter or whoever needs it most. That's what warmth is for, to be passed on when you have enough of your own." At 80, I sat in my garden again. Not the garden I had shared with Daniel. That house had been sold years ago, too large for one old woman to manage. but a smaller garden at the house I now shared with little Eleanor and her family, where I had my own room and my own space and all the warmth I could ever need. The sun was setting, as it had been setting on that evening 60 years before, when I had sat in this same position and thought about the choice Grandmother had given me. But everything else was different. I was not 20 anymore, not newly married, not standing at the beginning of a second chance. I was old and tired and ready. My hands were thin and spotted with age, but they rested peacefully in my lap. My body was wrapped in a shawl my granddaughter had made for me, thick wool in shades of blue that reminded me of stormy skies and frozen lakes. I closed my eyes and thought about the girl I had been, the one who had died cold and alone, surrounded by people who should have loved her, the one who had been given an impossible gift, a second chance, a new beginning, an opportunity to rewrite her entire story. I had not wasted it. I had kept my warmth for myself, and in doing so, I had found enough warmth to share with everyone I loved. I had built a life full of books and learning and laughter. I had raised daughters who knew their own worth, who would never give away more than they could afford to lose. I had loved and been loved, truly and deeply, and that was more than many people got in even one lifetime. The garden was quiet, peaceful. I could hear my great-grandchildren playing somewhere inside the house, their voices high and bright with joy. I smiled and let the last of the sunlight warm my face. And when I finally slipped away later that night, it was not in cold or darkness. It was in a room full of people who loved me, surrounded by blankets and warmth and the knowledge that I had lived exactly the life I was meant to live. The garden was waiting for me, just as I remembered it. The roses bloomed impossibly red. The wisteria climbed the ancient walls, and Grandmother stood on the path, her arms open wide. "Well, done," she said as I walked into her embrace. "Oh, my dear girl, well done." And at last, I was home.